Listen, I know what you're thinking. Gravedigger. It's not the kind of job you brag about at a cocktail party, assuming a guy like me ever got invited to a cocktail party. But I've been doing it for 20 years, right here at Harmony Hill Cemetery, just outside of Cedar Falls, Iowa. And I'll tell you something, there's an honesty to the work. It's the last honest deal a person gets. You live, you die, and I make sure you get 6 feet of good, quiet dirt on top of you. That's my job. And for 20 years, the earth has always taken what I gave it. It was reliable. It was solid. Until last fall. Before we get into this story, I want you to do one thing. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. City or country. Now, let's continue. You gotta understand the routine. It's what keeps you sane. The smell of the dirt, that's key. Some people think cemeteries smell like old flowers and sadness. Nope. They smell like turned earth and cut grass. Maybe a little pine if they dragged a fresh coffin through. My office was the quietest office in the whole county, just the wind and the occasional cry of a hawk. I start early. Way before the sun cracks the horizon, I'm out there with the backhoe, digging the hole. If the ground is frozen, it's a miserable job, a fight with the frost line. But this was late September, perfect digging weather. The dirt was rich, dark black, the kind of soil that makes Iowa famous. It crumbled just right off the shovel. The deceased that day was a Mr. Silas Peterson, 83 years old. Heart attack while watching the football game, I heard. A quiet ending for a quiet man. I pulled the backhoe up to plot 412, right under an old maple tree that was just starting to turn a brilliant fiery red. Hole 412. I remember counting the shovels full of dirt I moved that day, just a habit. Usually takes about 3 hours of steady work to get the hole exactly right. It has to be deep enough for the vault, and then deep enough for the final fill, plus room for the grass to grow back. You can't rush it. Rushing a grave is sloppy, and sloppy work means the stone will sink later, and that's a disrespect I won't stand for. I was finishing up scraping the bottom level, making sure the floor of the grave was flat as a kitchen table. Everything was textbook. The hole was clean. The piled dirt was neatly mounded on the protective tarp beside it. You don't want to mess up the surrounding grass for the mourners. I climbed out, dusted off my jeans, and stood looking down into the pit. 6 by 8, 6 feet deep. Perfect. I remember thinking, Silas, you got a nice spot here. The funeral was scheduled for 2 p.m. I ate my lunch, a cold turkey sandwich and a thermos of black coffee, sitting on the tailgate of my pickup, watching the limousines pull in. I always stay out of sight during the service. My job is done until the family leaves. I'm the cleanup crew. The service itself was short, maybe 30 people. The pastor read some scripture, a few sniffles, the usual stuff. They had one of those big, shiny mahogany caskets. Heavy wood. Expensive. When the last car pulled away, leaving just the pastor and the funeral home director, that's when I go back to work. First comes the vault. You see, most people don't get buried straight into the dirt anymore. The law in most places, and certainly the policy here at Harmony Hill, requires a burial vault, a heavy concrete box that the coffin sits inside. It protects the coffin from the weight of the earth and keeps the ground above from sinking in the future. It's a seal. It's a guarantee. We lowered the big mahogany casket into the pit, and then the crew from the funeral home backed away. Now, the vault lid is a beast. It weighs about 3,000 pounds. We use the small motorized lift to bring it over, swing it into position, and slowly, carefully lower it down onto the concrete base, sealing the casket inside. Clunk. That sound is the sound of finality. I supervised the crew as they sealed the vault. Everything looked fine. The ground around the edge was firm. This is the part where the dirt goes back in. Now, I've closed thousands of graves. I know how dirt behaves. You don't just dump it all back in and walk away. You have to layer it. You start slow, covering the top of the vault, Then you get the backhoe and start pushing the massive piles of soil back into the hole. You compact it slightly, layer by layer, until the hole is filled, creating a slight mound, because we know the dirt will settle over the next few weeks. I was about halfway through filling the grave when I felt it. The backhoe was rumbling, pushing the rich black soil. I hit the lever to compact the dirt I'd just pushed in, just a gentle press. But instead of the satisfying resistance of packed earth, the whole area around the grave felt spongy. I stopped the machine. I climbed down. "What's the matter, Frank?" asked Jimmy, one of the guys from the funeral home who was waiting to take the lift equipment away. "Nothing," I said, but I was already walking over to the grave. I stomped my boot down near the edge of the fill. It felt wrong. It wasn't firm. It felt like walking on a thick, damp sponge, and the dirt I'd just poured in, it was already settling too fast. Not sinking like a cave-in, but almost like it was dissolving from the inside. "Did we hit a spring here, maybe?" I asked Jimmy. Jimmy shrugged. "Nah, Frank. This section is dry as a bone. Old Silas would be floating if this was a spring." I went back to the backhoe. I pushed in more dirt. I tried to compact it harder this time. The machine groaned, and the earth just seemed to swallow the force. It was like trying to punch water. The mound I was building was disappearing almost as fast as I could create it. "This ain't right," I muttered to myself. I spent another hour working that patch of ground, long after Jimmy and the funeral home staff had left. I filled it. I compacted it. I walked away for 5 minutes, and when I came back, the mound had settled back down to level ground. Now a grave settles. That's normal. But it settles slowly, over weeks, not in 10 minutes. And it usually starts with a little dip in the center. This was settling evenly, almost like the hole wasn't there anymore, but without the density of solid earth. I was sweating, and not just from the work. I had a knot in my stomach. I'm a practical man. I deal with physics and geology. This wasn't physics. I figured maybe the soil had been disturbed by some old utility line that wasn't on the map, or maybe there was some kind of freak natural anomaly. I brought in 3 extra wheelbarrows full of topsoil from the supply shed, good, heavy clay soil, and I packed it down over the gravesite until it was a solid foot higher than the surrounding grass. I watered it heavily, hoping the moisture would help it bind. "There," I told the dirt. "You stay put." I cleaned up my equipment, locked the gates, and drove home. I didn't talk about it. Who was I going to tell? "Hey, Martha, the dirt at work today was acting weird." She'd think I was finally losing it. I tried to relax that evening, but I couldn't shake the feeling of that spongy earth under my boot. It felt like the ground was breathing, inhaling the soil I was trying to put back. I got maybe 4 hours of sleep. By 4 a.m., I was back in the truck, driving back to Harmony Hill. I told myself I was just going early to get a head start on the next grave. But really, I had to see hole 412. The cemetery was pitch black, silent, and cold. I drove my pickup slowly down the winding paths, the headlights cutting tunnels through the pre-dawn gloom. I parked near the maintenance shed and walked the rest of the way, carrying my heavy-duty flashlight. I found plot 412 under the maple tree. I shone the light on the grave. The mound was gone. Completely. The ground was perfectly flat, flatter even than the surrounding grass. It looked like someone had taken a giant roller and pressed the entire area down. All that extra soil I dumped on it, a full foot of elevation, it had vanished. It wasn't spread out around the edges. It was just gone into the hole. I walked onto the grave. The feeling was back, worse than before. It wasn't just spongy now. It felt hollow. I dropped to my knees, shining the light directly down. And that's when I saw it. In the center of the grave, where the vault lid should have been buried at least 3 feet down, there was a hairline crack running in a perfect rectangle. The soil hadn't just settled. It had separated. And through that crack, something was pushing up. It was just a sliver, maybe 1/4 of an inch wide and maybe a foot long. but it was enough to see the pale, gray concrete of the vault lid. The burial vault, the 3,000-pound concrete box, had risen. I stood up so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't settling. This wasn't a sinkhole. The earth, the ground itself, had compressed the soil above the vault and pushed the entire structure back towards the surface. I'm a man who believes in gravity. I believe in weight. 3,000 pounds doesn't just float up. I walked around the grave, checking the parameters. The surrounding ground was solid. The only place affected was the 6-by-8-foot rectangle directly above Mr. Silas Peterson. It was an island of instability. I spent the next hour just staring, trying to rationalize it. Maybe the ground was waterlogged and the vault acted like a boat? No, the vault is solid concrete, not designed to be buoyant, and this section was dry. Maybe gas pressure? No, there was no smell, no venting. The only conclusion left was the one I didn't want to touch. The earth was actively rejecting the body. I knew I couldn't leave it like this. If someone walked over that spot, they'd realize the ground was wrong. And if it kept rising, the slab would eventually break through the surface, and that would be a catastrophe. People would panic. I would lose my job, and frankly, my mind. I had to put Mr. Peterson back where he belonged. I went back to the shed and got the heavy equipment. I needed the backhoe and the tamper, and maybe some extra heavy fill. I decided I would dig the grave up, inspect the vault and the surrounding soil for any weirdness, and then rebury it with much heavier, denser clay, packed down with industrial force. It was a hell of a job. It took me until 8 a.m. to carefully dig out the soil I had just put in yesterday. I worked slowly, gently scraping the earth away until I hit the top of the concrete vault again. When I cleared the surface, the sight made me freeze. The vault was completely exposed, sitting just 2 feet below the surface. It should have been at least 4.5 feet down. It had definitely risen. And worse, there was something else. Where the vault lid met the base, there was a seam of fine, dry dust. It looked like the kind of powder you get when you run rock through a grinder. And it was spilling out. I reached down, pulling a handful of the dust away. It was extremely dry, like talcum powder, even though the surrounding soil was damp. It felt wrong. I decided I needed to lift the vault completely out. I attached the heavy-duty straps, fired up the lift motor, and slowly, painstakingly, pulled the 3,000-pound concrete box out of the ground. As soon as the vault cleared the hole itself changed. The sides of the grave, which I had dug clean and square the day before, started to collapse inward. But they weren't just falling, they were moving fast, almost like the earth was trying to heal itself, trying to close the wound I had just opened. I scrambled back from the edge. The walls buckled and crumbled, and within 30 seconds, the 6-foot-deep hole was barely 4 feet deep, filled with fresh, loose soil that had poured in from the sides. It looked like a giant scoop had come in and rounded out the bottom. I stared at the vault sitting on the grass. Then I stared at the hole, which was now too shallow to hold the vault. It was actively refusing to be a grave. I had never seen anything like it. Soil doesn't behave like that. It doesn't have an agenda. But this earth, the ground meant to hold Silas Peterson, was fighting me. It was saying, no, not here, not him. I had to figure out what was going on, and I only had a few hours before the crew showed up for the day. I had to put the vault back, no matter what. I grabbed a shovel and tried to dig the hole back down to 6 feet, but the ground fought me every inch of the way. I'd dig out a scoop of earth, and 2 more scoops would slide in from the side. It was like digging in wet sugar. The soil refused to hold a vertical wall. Finally, in frustration, I plunged the shovel deep into the center of the shallow pit. It hit something hard, a foot or so below the new, collapsed floor. I dug around the object. It wasn't rock. It was a chunk of old red brick, maybe part of an ancient foundation. But that wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what was surrounding the brick. The soil around this brick was different. It was clay, yes, but it was coated in a thin, greasy film. And as I dug it out, the air changed. It wasn't a smell of decay or gas. It was a faint, sharp scent, metallic and bitter, like old pennies and ozone. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I pulled the brick out. As I did, the hole seemed to sigh, and the walls crumbled a little more. I looked down at the empty space. I had to get the vault back in. I didn't have time to move Mr. Peterson to a new plot. The family would be back soon to visit. I decided I had to force the issue. I used the backhoe to push the walls back, creating a wider, shallower depression. Then I used the lift to lower the vault back in, even though it was only going down about 3 feet now. I told myself, I'll just fill it with concrete. If the earth won't hold the dirt, it'll have to hold the cement. It was a desperate, expensive solution, but I was running out of time and sanity. I called the supplier and told them I needed a load of quick-setting, flowable fill, a thick, soupy cement mix, delivered immediately to Plot 412. I told them it was an emergency repair due to a massive sinkhole. They didn't ask questions. While I waited, I looked back at the vault. I knew it wasn't deep enough, but it was sitting level. I walked over to it, just to check the seal one last time. I knelt down beside the heavy concrete box, and that's when I heard it. A tiny sound, muffled and faint, coming from inside the vault. Tap, tap, tap. It was too rhythmic to be settling dirt, too deliberate to be water. It sounded exactly like someone, or something, was knocking on the inside of the coffin. My hands started shaking so violently I dropped my flashlight. It clattered against the concrete vault. Tap, tap, tap. Then a pause. And then a sound that wasn't a knock, but a scrape. A slow, heavy scrape against the inside of the concrete. I scrambled backwards, crawling away from the grave on my hands and knees. Silas Peterson was inside that vault. Silas Peterson was dead. 83 years old, heart attack, certified dead. But something was moving in there. And the earth wouldn't take him. And now, I knew why. Whatever was in that box, it didn't belong 6 feet under. And it wanted out. I dropped that flashlight and scrambled back, crawling away from the grave on my hands and knees like a fool. My blood was ice water. Tap, tap, tap. It happened again. Muffled, yes, but absolutely clear. It wasn't the sound of dirt settling. It wasn't a tree root hitting the concrete. It was internal. It was intentional. I managed to stop about 15 feet away, crouching behind the backhoe for cover, which, looking back, is just laughable. What was a backhoe going to do against a dead man? I forced myself to breathe. Silas Peterson, 83 years old, heart attack, dead. I repeated it like a mantra, trying to drag my brain back to reality. There had to be a natural explanation. Maybe the funeral home guys put something in the vault with him. A tool, a heavy piece of hardware, and it was shifting now that the vault was resting unevenly. But then the tapping stopped, and the heavy, grinding scrape came again. It wasn't a metallic sound. It sounded like thick, old bone dragging across the inside of the mahogany coffin. A slow, heavy movement, like something trying to push itself upright. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. 5 seconds that felt like I aged 5 years. I stayed frozen there, waiting for the sound to come again, but the cemetery fell back into that deep, heavy silence. The silence of early morning, broken only by the diesel engine of my parked truck idling nearby. I finally got enough guts to stand up. I felt exposed, standing there in the middle of Harmony Hill, arguing with a dead man who wouldn't stay buried. I had maybe an hour, maybe less, before the crew from Parks and Rec showed up to mow the lawn, or before Mrs. Albright came to put flowers on her husband's grave down the hill. I couldn't leave Mr. Peterson sitting half out of the ground, knocking on his own coffin. I grabbed my dropped flashlight, my hand still shaking, and walked back to the shallow hole. I shone the light directly onto the concrete lid. "Listen, Silas," I whispered, my voice rough and dry. "I don't know what your problem is, but you need to relax. You're causing me a serious professional headache." Silence. Just the damp, metallic scent of the disturbed earth. I knew the concrete truck was on its way, that quick-setting, flowable fill. My desperate plan was still my only plan: seal him in cement. If the earth wouldn't hold him, maybe man-made rock would. I was leaning against the backhoe, checking my watch, when I heard the rumble. Not the quiet purr of my truck, but the heavy, grinding low gear of a cement mixer. Mike, the driver, was early. Perfect. I quickly grabbed my shovel and started kicking the loose, collapsed dirt back over the edges of the vault, trying to make it look less exposed, more like a normal repair job. The big yellow mixer rolled down the path, its drum turning slowly, and pulled up right beside Plot 412. Mike climbed out, a big guy with a bright orange safety vest and a permanent grin. He looked completely out of place in the quiet, nervous morning. "Morning, Frank. You got yourself a real mess here, huh?" Mike shouted cheerfully over the idling engine. "Sinkhole special, you said?" I walked over, trying to keep my face neutral. "Yeah, Mike, bad one. Hit some old drainage issues, I think. We need to fill this cavity fast. Put the chute right over the center of the vault, please." Mike peered into the hole, looking at the concrete box sitting maybe 2.5 feet down. He frowned a little. "That vault looks awful shallow, Frank. You sure you want this much fill? This stuff sets up like a rock." "Trust me, Mike. The ground underneath is unstable. I need to make a solid shelf for the rest of the soil." I kept my voice firm. I couldn't let him know the truth. I was basically building a concrete cage around a 3,000-pound box that had just tried to float away. Mike shrugged. "He's a cement guy. He delivers what you order." He backed the massive truck up carefully and swung the long metal chute over the grave site. "All right, flowable fill coming up. You want it slow and steady?" "Start slow," I said. He hit the lever. The drum groaned, and the thick gray slurry started oozing out of the chute. It wasn't like regular concrete. This stuff was engineered to flow quickly and fill every void, then cure hard as granite. The cement hit the top of the vault with a heavy, wet splash. It immediately started flowing down the sides, filling the gap between the vault and the dirt walls that the earth had so aggressively tried to close. As the cement level rose, filling the hole, I was listening. Listening over the roar of the truck, the sloshing of the mix, and the frantic pounding in my chest. I was waiting for the sound. The cement was now halfway up the sides of the vault, starting to cover the seam where the lid met the base, the seam where the dusty powder had spilled out. Scrape. It was faint now, muffled by the rising cement, but it was there. A desperate, heavy sound like whatever was inside knew this was the end of its freedom. I stood right next to the chute. "Faster, Mike! Give me more pressure!" Mike looked surprised, but cranked the lever. The flow increased, a thick, gray river pouring into the hole. The cement rose quickly, covering the vault completely. I saw the surface of the cement bubble slightly over the center of the vault, not like air escaping, but like something pushing up from below. A silent, internal pressure. I held my breath. I had just encased Mr. Silas Peterson in a solid concrete tomb. If he was still alive, he was definitely gone now. And if he was something else, well, maybe this would hold it. The cement filled the remaining depression, creating a level gray slab about 2 feet below the surrounding ground. "That ought to hold a battleship, Frank," Mike said, wiping his hands on his pants. "Yeah, thanks, Mike. Send me the bill for the emergency rate." I paid him cash for a quick transaction, wanting him gone. I needed this secret buried deeper than Silas Peterson. As Mike drove off, the cement mixer's noise fading into the distance, the silence that descended was heavy, oppressive. The metallic ozone scent was stronger now, trapped by the fresh cement. I stood over the grave, watching the surface of the fill. It was already starting to haze over, the quick set working its magic. I felt a wave of nausea, half from fear, half from the sheer desperate effort of the last few hours. I had just committed an act of gross misconduct, potentially sealed a living man in concrete, and violated every burial protocol known to man. But I had stopped the thing that was trying to claw its way out. Or had I? I walked around the edges of the freshly poured cement. The surrounding soil, the black Iowa dirt that had refused to hold the hole, was now pressed against the hard edges of the cement slab. I knelt down and placed my hand on the ground just outside the perimeter. The earth felt cold, but not frozen. And then I saw it. Where the cement met the dirt, there was a tiny, fresh ripple of soil being pushed away. Not much, maybe 1/10 of an inch, but it was continuous, like something was exerting pressure from the center, trying to expand the boundary of the grave. The cement hadn't stopped the rejection. It had only solidified the battlefield. The earth was still pushing against the intrusion. I grabbed a small garden trowel from the backhoe toolbox and started scraping away the disturbed soil at the edge of the cement. I dug down maybe 6 inches, and when I pulled the trowel out, the metallic, bitter scent flared up, making my eyes water. And there, embedded in the black soil, were those strange, greasy clay clumps I had found earlier, the ones surrounding the old brick. It was like the earth was trying to cordon off the area, or maybe it was concentrating its defense. I knew I couldn't dig it out again. The cement was solid now. I had to let it cure and then cover it with a thick layer of topsoil and sod, making it look like the perfect, peaceful grave of Mr. Silas Peterson. But the tapping, the scraping, the feeling of the earth itself fighting back, it demanded an explanation. I had to know who Silas Peterson truly was. The cemetery files were useless, just dates and next of kin. I needed more than that. I needed history. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning up the site meticulously. I covered the cement slab with 3 feet of good topsoil, creating the proper mound, and laid fresh sod over it all. By 11 a.m., Plot 412 looked pristine. It looked like the most secure grave in the entire county. I packed up my gear and drove back to the maintenance office. I didn't clock out. I told my assistant, Gary, that I had a critical equipment pickup in Cedar Falls and would be back later. I drove my pickup straight into town, not to a hardware store, but to the Cedar Falls Public Library. I walked past the familiar rows of books, heading straight for the microfilm archives, the old newspapers. I pulled up the records from 83 years ago, when Silas Peterson would have been born, and then started searching for anything related to him or his family history in Cedar Falls. The obituary was exactly what the funeral director had said. Quiet life, devoted to his community, loved football. Nothing unusual, but I kept digging, going further back, searching the local papers from the 1950s and 60s, when Silas would have been a young man. I found him. Not in an obituary, but in a small article buried deep in the local news and incidents section of the Cedar Falls Gazette, dated July 12, 1957. The headline was small, almost an afterthought. Local boy involved in quarry accident. The article detailed how 20-year-old Silas Peterson, working a summer job at the old limestone quarry just north of town, had been involved in an accident. A large earth-moving machine had overturned. Silas was trapped underneath the cab for several hours before rescue. He survived, obviously, but the description of the accident was chilling. The article noted the difficulty of the rescue, emphasizing that the ground around the overturned machine was unusually soft and difficult to manage, and that the rescue crew had trouble keeping the hole open as they dug him out. The earth tried to swallow him then, too. I kept reading. A few weeks later, another small notice mentioned Silas had recovered but had been changed by the event, becoming withdrawn and leaving town shortly after. He didn't return to Cedar Falls until he was in his late 70s. Why did the earth reject him 60 years later? Was this just some deep-seated geological grudge? I closed the microfilm reader, feeling the fear crawl back. It wasn't just a random event. The connection was clear. The Earth had tried to claim him once, failed, and now, when given a second chance, it was refusing to hold him. It was pushing him out. I needed to know more about that quarry accident, but the paper trail ended there. I drove to the county courthouse next. I pulled the property records for the Peterson family. Silas had inherited a small piece of land outside of town when he returned. It was just a few acres of woodland near the old riverbed. But what caught my eye wasn't the size of the property. It was the date of purchase by his grandfather, back in 1905. The land was referred to in the old deeds by a local, unofficial name, the Unsettled Plot. I called the county clerk, a woman named Beverly I'd known for years, and asked her about the term. "Oh, that old name?" Beverly chuckled. "That's just folklore, Frank. That piece of land, they say nothing ever grew right there. Always shifting, sinking. Farmers avoided it. They said the dirt was cursed, wouldn't take anything you planted." Wouldn't take anything you planted. My blood ran cold again. It wasn't just Silas, it was his history, his family, the land itself. I drove straight back to Harmony Hill. It was 3:00 p.m. The cemetery was busy with the afternoon visitors. Everything looked normal. Plot 412 looked perfect, the new sod blending in seamlessly. A quiet, peaceful grave. I walked the perimeter, keeping my distance, watching. The ground was holding. The concrete was doing its job. I walked over to the maintenance shed and found Gary, my assistant, cleaning the windows of the riding mower. "Hey, Frank, everything okay with that sinkhole?" he asked. "Yeah, Gary, big mess. Had to use some heavy fill. It's solid now." "Good. Say, Frank, I almost forgot. The funeral director, Mr. Davies, stopped by earlier, said he was checking the paperwork for the Peterson service." "Oh, yeah?" I tried to sound casual. "Yeah." He looked a little stressed. He said he was reviewing the pre-arrangements, said Mr. Peterson had a very specific, unusual request for his burial. I leaned against the shed wall. "What kind of request?" Gary lowered his voice, looking around. "Davies said Peterson insisted on a specific type of soil for the final fill. Said he wanted the dirt that was taken out of the hole to be used, and only that dirt. Davies thought it was weird, but they put it in the contract." I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach. The rich, black Iowa soil I had dug out of hole 412 was exactly the soil the Earth had immediately rejected. It was the soil that had dissolved, but I hadn't used that original soil. I had covered the vault with heavy clay and then used new topsoil. The original soil, the specific black dirt from plot 412, was still sitting piled neatly on the tarp right beside the grave. If Silas Peterson had insisted on that specific dirt, he must have known something about it. He must have known it wouldn't hold him. I looked at the pile of original soil, dark and rich, waiting patiently on the tarp. I walked over to it, knelt down, and ran my hand through the dirt. It felt cool, crumbly, and smelled deeply of the earth. But mixed in with the soil, I saw something shiny. I dug my fingers into the pile and pulled out a small object. It was a shard of metal, about the size of my thumb. It was rusted and pitted, clearly very old. It looked like a piece of a clock mechanism, or maybe a piece of a heavy lock. But as I held it, the metallic, bitter ozone smell that had haunted me all day intensified. It was coming from the soil, and specifically from this small piece of metal. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a fight over something. I put the shard in my pocket. I had to get rid of that dirt. If the original soil was the key to this whole mess, it couldn't stay here. I fired up the backhoe again, but instead of moving the dirt back onto the grave, I drove the backhoe away, lifting the tarp and dumping the entire pile of original soil into the deepest drainage ditch at the very edge of the cemetery property. I buried it under heavy gravel and rocks. I felt a brief sense of completion, like I had finally closed the loop on Mr. Peterson's weird request. I went home that evening exhausted. I didn't tell Martha a thing. I just sat in my armchair staring at the small, rusty shard of metal on my coffee table, trying to make sense of the clockwork pattern etched into it. I finally fell asleep, heavy and troubled. I woke up to the sound of rain. A heavy, wind-driven Iowa storm was tearing through the night. I checked the clock, 2:00 a.m., and then I heard the phone ring. It was the dedicated cemetery line, the one that only rang if the security alarm was tripped. I snatched the phone. "Harmony Hill, Frank speaking." It was the alarm company. "Mr. Miller, we have a breach at the main gate. Looks like the fence line near the old maple grove. Sensors are tripping repeatedly. Could be animals, but the vibrations are heavy." The old maple grove. That was plot 412. I told them I was on my way. I threw on my boots and a heavy coat, grabbed my shotgun, just in case it was kids or vandals, and raced out the door. The drive was miserable. The rain was coming down in sheets, visibility was near zero, and the wind was howling. When I finally pulled up to the cemetery gates, the padlock was dangling open, swinging wildly in the wind. The chain was cut clean through. I drove straight to plot 412. I shone the headlights toward the grave site. The mound of fresh sod and topsoil I had laid down just hours earlier was gone. The heavy rain had washed away some of the loose dirt, but most of it wasn't washed away. It looked like it had been scraped off, and the gray concrete slab underneath, the one that was supposed to be 2 feet down, was fully exposed. It was sitting right on the surface. The earth had pushed it up again. The cement hadn't stopped it. I cut the engine, listening to the rain hammer the truck roof. Then I heard it, faint over the storm. It wasn't a tap or a scrape. It was a groan, a heavy grinding sound of concrete under immense pressure. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the downpour. I walked right up to the exposed vault. The entire concrete slab was vibrating, and then right in the center of the slab, the quick-set cement I had poured just hours ago began to crack. A hairline fracture appeared, running the length of the slab. It widened quickly, spiderwebbing across the surface, and through the widening crack, the metallic, bitter scent exploded, thick and overwhelming, tasting like ozone and old iron. The crack reached the edge of the slab, and a small puff of the fine, dry, talcum-like dust, the dust I had seen spilling from the vault, shot out. The concrete slab groaned one last time, a sound of defeat, and then, with a sickening shunk, the entire center section of the cement broke inward, collapsing into the void below. I shone the flashlight into the new hole. The vault was still there, but the cement casing was shattered, and the 3,000-pound concrete lid of the burial vault itself, the final seal, was gone. It hadn't risen. It had been pushed off. It was leaning upright against the side of the hole I had dug, completely dislodged, sitting in the mud. The mahogany casket of Mr. Silas Peterson was fully exposed to the rain, and the lid of the casket was open, wide open. I pointed the flashlight down into the mud and the water pooling around the dark, heavy wood. The casket was empty. I pointed the flashlight down into the mud and the water pooling around the dark, heavy wood. The casket was empty. My heart didn't just pound. It seized up, a cold, hard lump in my chest. The rain was washing over me, mingling with the sweat that poured down my face despite the cold wind. I stumbled back, tripping over the concrete lid that was leaning against the edge of the hole. I hit the muddy ground hard. I didn't care. I scrambled away, trying to keep the beam of the flashlight trained on the empty mahogany box. The lining was still there, the white satin ripped where the lid had been forced open, but the space for Mr. Silas Peterson was vacant. No body, no sign of struggle, except for the sheer impossible violence done to the concrete and the coffin itself. I wasn't dealing with a zombie movie. This wasn't a dead man who clawed his way out. This was something bigger, something that defied the laws of weight and physics and death. I forced myself up, shaking off the mud. I grabbed the shotgun, Not because I thought it would help, but because holding something heavy and familiar was the only thing keeping me from screaming and running. I walked back to the edge of the hole, looking down. The rain was filling the cavity, washing the shattered concrete and the ripped satin. The metallic, bitter smell was everywhere. Where did he go? I looked around the cemetery. The storm was too loud, too thick. You couldn't see 10 feet. But I looked for drag marks, for footprints, for anything. Nothing. The ground was just churned mud and grass, disrupted only by my own truck and the chaos around Plot 412. He hadn't left the grave. He had been taken. I looked at the gaping hole and the shattered cement. The earth hadn't just pushed him out, it had devoured the structure I had built to contain him. It was a rejection of the seal, not necessarily the body itself. And then I remembered the dirt, the specific black original soil from hole 412. The soil Silas Peterson had insisted on being used. The soil I had dumped in the drainage ditch hours ago. If the earth was fighting me because I didn't use the right materials, then maybe the original soil was the key to stabilizing this whole mess. Maybe that soil was the only thing that could truly hold him, or maybe it was the only thing the earth would tolerate being there. I had to get that dirt back. And I had to do it now, before dawn broke, and the local police found an empty grave and a shell-shocked gravedigger holding a shotgun. I ran back to the backhoe, which was sitting covered in mud near the maintenance shed. I fired it up, the engine roaring in protest against the storm. I drove it hard and fast toward the far edge of the cemetery, where the old drainage ditch met the property line. I found the spot. The heavy gravel and rocks I had used to cover the original soil were already being washed away by the torrent of water. Below the gravel, the rich, black Iowa earth was waiting, smelling of that bitter ozone. I used the backhoe bucket, scooping up the soaking wet, heavy pile of soil. It was the color of midnight and felt unnaturally heavy, almost dense like iron ore. As I loaded the bucket, I noticed something else glinting in the mud. I climbed down and dug it out with my fingers. It was another piece of metal, identical to the first one I found, a small, rusted shard of what looked like old clockwork. 2 shards. One from the original disturbed soil around the vault, and one from the pile of soil Silas had specifically requested. Whatever was happening, it was linked to this metal and this specific ground. Maybe Silas Peterson wasn't a man at all, but a mechanism, and the earth was trying to reclaim its components. I didn't waste time thinking about it. I put the second shard in my pocket, climbed back into the backhoe, and drove back toward Plot 412, carrying the heavy bucket of black, tainted soil. When I reached the grave, the scene was worse. The rain was still pounding, and the water level in the hole was rising, swirling around the empty, open casket. The sides of the hole were collapsing again, but this time they were collapsing inward, toward the center, like the earth was trying to seal the wound forcefully. I positioned the backhoe directly over the hole. I looked down one last time at the exposed, empty coffin, half submerged in the rising water. "All right, Silas," I whispered into the wind. "You win. You get your dirt." I tilted the bucket. The massive load of black, heavy soil poured out, splashing into the grave, mixing with the water and the shattered concrete. I kept pouring, scoop after scoop. I didn't care about compaction or neatness anymore. I was performing an exorcism, a desperate ritual to appease the ground. The metallic, bitter scent, which had been so strong, started to retreat the moment the original soil hit the hole. It wasn't instant, but as the black earth covered the shattered concrete and filled the empty spaces, the air felt like it was cleaning itself. I finished the pile, pouring the last of the heavy, wet soil into the grave. The hole was now filled, not with a neat mound, but with a dense, solid mass of black mud and broken cement. I sat in the backhoe, letting the engine idle, listening. The heavy internal groaning that had preceded the cement cracking was gone. The intense vibration I felt under my boots earlier was gone. The ground was silent. Not the silence of a normal cemetery, but the absolute deep quiet of a conflict concluded. The earth had accepted its own. I climbed down. The rain was easing slightly, turning into a steady drizzle. I walked onto the gravesite. It was solid, firm. The spongy, hollow feeling was completely gone. I stomped my boot down, right over where the empty casket lay, buried deep beneath the saturated black soil. It felt like walking on concrete. The earth had stopped fighting. I stood there for a long time, just breathing the air. The ozone scent was replaced by the clean smell of wet grass and pine needles. The ground had finally settled. I spent the next 2 hours as the first gray light of dawn broke over Harmony Hill, cleaning up the mess. I used the backhoe to push the edges of the surrounding grass back into place, smoothing the surface of the grave. I didn't try to mound it. I left it flat, dense, and level. I gathered the shattered pieces of the quick-set cement and the massive dislodged vault lid. I loaded them onto a flatbed trailer and drove them back to the maintenance shed. They were evidence of the impossible, and I had to destroy them. I smashed the concrete pieces into oblivion with a sledgehammer and buried them under the compost heap. By 7:00 a.m., when Gary, my assistant, pulled in, Plot 412 looked exactly like a grave that had suffered a severe sinkhole and had been professionally repaired. Flat, solid, and covered in fresh, dark soil. I met Gary at the shed. I was soaked, muddy, and running on zero sleep. "Morning, Frank. Rough night?" Gary asked, looking at my state. "Worst storm I've seen in years, Gary," I said, my voice hoarse. "Hit Plot 412 hard. Massive failure. Ground gave way completely. I was out here all night putting it right." "Wow. Did the vault drop?" "No," I lied, looking him straight in the eye. "The ground just dissolved around it. Had to re-dig, repack, and use the heaviest clay we have. It's solid now. Don't touch it for a week." Gary nodded, used to my professional intensity. He never questioned the details of the dirt. I went home, showered, and collapsed into bed. I didn't tell Martha anything, but I kept the 2 rusted metal shards on my nightstand, a secret between me and the silent earth. The story of Silas Peterson was never resolved in any official way. The funeral home director, Mr. Davies, called me a few days later, worried about the exposed cement. I assured him the repair was complete and irreversible. "You know, Frank," Davies said, his voice low, "the Peterson family called. They were asking about the vault. They wanted to know if the seal was holding." "It's holding," I told him. "It's the most solid grave in Harmony Hill." I never mentioned the empty casket. The only people who knew Mr. Peterson was gone were me and the ground itself. I kept working at Harmony Hill. The earth, once again, became my reliable partner. It took everybody I gave it, quietly, respectfully, without complaint. But I never forgot the feeling of that spongy ground, the sound of that tapping, and the sight of that empty coffin. I learned that day that my job wasn't just to dig holes and fill them. My job was to negotiate the final peace treaty between the living and the dead, and sometimes the earth has a right of refusal. I still have those metal shards. I keep them locked away in a safe deposit box downtown. They look like pieces of an old clock, and I've spent 20 years wondering what time they were supposed to keep. I never found out what Silas Peterson was or where he went. But I know this. He was something the ground hated being contained and something the ground desperately wanted to claim. By burying him with the wrong materials, I had accidentally imprisoned him, and the earth fought until the prison broke. I learned to respect the dirt more than I respected the dead. I follow the burial protocols to the letter now, especially when it comes to the soil. Because I know that somewhere out there, walking around Cedar Falls, Iowa, is a man who died 83 years old of a heart attack, who the earth wouldn't accept. And if he ever comes back, I just pray he doesn't need a new grave, because I don't think I have the strength to fight the ground for him again. And that, folks, is why I don't look at a patch of turned earth the same way anymore. It's not just dirt, it's the final word, and sometimes that word is no.